guys! So today we have a very special day. Here we are in front of the University of Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, and we're gonna interview a very special guest. Stay tuned. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Let's go. So, like I said earlier, we have a very special guest with us. Here is Professor Gillespie. So, first of all, could you tell us a little bit about your career?
Sure. I actually grew up here in the Fraser Valley, over in Chilliwack, and I went to Simon Fraser University to study biology and ecology.
Oh, that's good.
And while I was there, I worked with Dr. Elizabeth Ellie doing some field research in pollinators on Vancouver Island, and I got really interested in the interactions between plants and bees that visit them, right?
Yes.
So, I was interested in bee flowers and what they're doing and why they have the flowers that they have. And then you have to think about the bees as soon as you think about the flowers. So based on that, I looked to go to graduate school to get my PhD. I wanted to study bees some more. So I went out to Massachusetts, actually, so about as far from here as you can get without leaving the continent. And I worked with Dr. Lynn Adler there. And while I was there, I studied pathogens and diseases of bumblebees.
Oh, I see.
Right? And from there, once I got my PhD, I went to California. I've been all over the place. I went to California and worked on pollination in seed crops in California. So from sort of a more ecological question to a more applied question in agriculture. Came back up here to work with Elizabeth for a little while before I got my job here at UFV, the University of the Fraser Valley.
That's so cool. So did your passion or, wanting to study biology and all of this, how do you put it, all of like the bees and pollinators, did it start when you were young or is it something that you built upon?
That's a bit of a funny story. So my parents are both biologists. So I had a little bit of the looking at the world and thinking about natural history and thinking about what's going on in the world right from the beginning. Of like, what is that and what is it doing and why is it there? So my dad's an entomologist, he's retired now, and my mom was a professor here at UFV. So I just got really excited about nature and I thought I'm going to study biology and be a scientist. And then,
awesome.
Depending on who you meet and what they're excited about, you get excited about it as well. And working with Elizabeth at SFU is what really got me interested in bees.
I see. So you mentioned that you are focused or you like to look around what's happening around the world. So with that, you might have heard that last year Canada Post launched 2 post stamps that showed the metallic green bee and the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, and actually my sister and I were able to interview the
I watched
artists.
that video, actually. That was a really great interview.
Yeah, so my first question here is, so what's the situation today with the Rusty Patched Bumblebee and the metallic green bee?
Yeah, so those 2 bees are actually pretty different, and I think they were chosen for the stamps for somewhat different reasons. So the metallic green bee, from what I can tell, is actually pretty common. And so it's in the family Agapostemon, it's a ground nester. And it's really fairly abundant in natural areas, and I think they chose it because it's really beautiful. So it's really unusually beautiful. It's not the sort of thing, when you think of a bee, people think of honeybees, or they might think of bumblebees if they know a little bit more, but these sort of green, shiny things that are solitary, that don't have a colony, there's no queen, they maybe haven't even thought of that before.
Yes.
Right? So the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, I think, was chosen because it's the first bee that was legally listed as endangered in Canada.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Right, so at the time of listing, from what I could tell, it was present at one little park in Ontario. And when something is listed, it's actually it's a legal process, right? So this is law, now it's got legal protection. And there's a process that governments have to go through now to figure out what to do.
Nice.
Right, so they come up with a plan. And then they're supposed to put that plan into action. And for the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, scientists and government officials came up with a plan. And sometimes this involves the province as well as federally. So the province has a plan. My colleague Sheila Kalla in Ontario was involved in coming up with that plan. And as far as I know right now, they're just trying to put that plan into action. And it takes a long time for a population, for a species to recover from kind of being on the brink.
Yes.
Right? And a lot of species that are endangered in Canada might be more abundant if you go farther south, right? So they're kind of up at the northern edge of where they can live. And maybe you guys who live in the north, you know a little bit about being up on the northern edge of what's comfortable. So if we try to help them recover, we've got all these populations that can kind of contribute to that. But the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, and we have a similar species here in BC called the White-tailed Bumblebee.
The White-tailed Bumblebee, yes.
Yeah, that is not listed, but it used to be common everywhere, and now it's really uncommon, much like the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. And so there's nowhere for the individuals to come from, even if we fix up the habitats where they're going to live. So it's a long process. They'd like to maybe try to find queens and bring them into the lab and rear them to try to kind of bolster the population, but that's tricky. So I would say work in progress as far as efforts to help that species recover from coming close to being extinct.
Yeah, you see, last year we live in a farm and we started planting a whole bunch of, pollinator-friendly flowers just to invite. And the reason why we were so interested in, is the population of the metallic green bee or the Rusty Patched Bumblebee decreasing is because for the first time in our lives we saw a metallic green bee.
Yeah.
And we were shook. We thought it was one of the prettiest
They're
things we've
amazing.
ever seen.
Yes.
So that's why this questioning came out of curiosity.
Yes.
And after the Canada Post launch, did it raise more awareness of our pollinators?
I think so. I think there's been a lot. So when I started studying bees, this sort of when you do science and when you do what I do, you go out into a park with a net and people go, what are you doing? And I would say, well, and they think, are you collecting butterflies? I'm like, no, I'm collecting bees. I'm studying bees. And they go, oh, I was stung by a bee once. And
Yes.
you talk to them a bit and they were stung by a wasp. Right, so they don't even know what a bee is. So this was prior to the colony collapse and the honeybees and sort of this global awareness of pollinators. And now people are like, oh, are the bees in trouble? Like, what's happening with the bees? So there's sort of this general engagement that's kind of balanced with a lot of misinformation, right? So people go, wait, there's more than one kind of bee?
Yes.
There's more than one kind of bee? And I go, well, there's actually 450 species of bees in British Columbia, right? And there's like 800 in Canada, thousands in North America. And things like the postage stamp get people thinking, wait, that's not a honeybee. What is that? Oh,
Yes.
There's these other things out there, and there's an incredible diversity of them.
It gets them more interested in
Exactly.
into that.
And then people will always ask, what can I do?
Yes, and that actually leads to the next question. So, from your perspective, so what can people do, no matter where they live, so in cities, towns, farms, for example, for us, what could they do to help our pollinators or bring them back in some kind of way?
So you've already done what I would suggest, which is to plant a garden, right? So bees need two things, much like we do. They need a place to live, and they need something to eat.
Yes.
Right, and different bees need different kinds of places to live, and maybe they need different kinds of foods at different times of the year, right? So some bees have very short lifespan. Maybe they need food for a couple weeks. Some bees live for the entire summer or for multiple years if you have colonies of honeybees, and then they need food for a long period of time.
Yes.
So if you plant a garden with flowers from the early spring into the fall, you're going to support those pollinators so that they have something to eat. Now, if you live in a city like I have for a lot of my life, and you're in an apartment and you can't plant a garden, one of the best things you can do is get involved with ecological restoration, right? So there's efforts, for example, in Vancouver to pull out invasive blackberry and plant a diversity of native plants, right? And the problem with things like blackberry is they flower, there's lots of food on them, but it's for like a week, right? Can you imagine you're only allowed to eat for a week of the year, and you're only allowed to eat McDonald's? Right, so you've got a week of food, and you live for the entire year, and then what do I do? Right, so a diversity of plants means there's lots of different kinds of foods at lots of different times of the year, which helps support a diversity of pollinators.
So is there any plant in general you would suggest for people who live in a city to plant that you love to visit?
It depends entirely on where you live. So it's what I suggest is doing a little research online. There's a few different, and I have a couple listed of pollinator societies that have plant lists. And if you're planting a garden, it's nice to plant native plants.
Yes.
But it's also nice to plant things that are just beautiful. So as long as they're not invasive, right? So there's some things like butterfly bush that are really great for bees, but they're also escaping into gardens and kind of becoming invasive. So as long as you're thinking about what you're planting, I think it's fine to also have things like lavender that bees really love, that are beautiful in your garden, but maybe they're not native. So a little bit of both, I think, is
Yes,
nice.
some of the plants that we plant are sweet clover, phacelias, they love.
Oh, they love
They
phacelias.
love phacelias.
It's on the list of most seed lists. anywhere if you're going to try and support bees. There's a lot of nectar and a lot of pollen, and they really love it.
Yes, that's right. So with that, with all this information, what would you think if we help our pollinators? What do you think will happen in the next 20 years? So both in like the positive, if we do work to help our pollinators, or in the negative, like saying if we don't really pay attention to it.
Yeah, so it's a hard thing to answer, because when you're talking about 400 species, they're going to respond in different ways to the different stresses. And there's some bees that we call them weedy bees that just do really well in disturbed places. They can kind of deal with the way that we've disrupted things, and they kind of coexist. They're a little bit like the sparrows or things that you just see in cities anyways, or pigeons, right? So some of those bees are likely going to stay common, and the efforts that we make to do some restoration will help some of those bees that are less tolerant of disturbance maybe come back.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and you can really see this, and I think it's a side effect of how interested in bees and conservation people are starting to be. So in Victoria, they have these patches of this endangered habitat called the Garry Oak, and it supports a huge diversity of bees in the spring. And there's these little patches, and they tend to get invaded by Scotch broom.
Oh,
and that wipes out the native plants. And there's this hobby people have called broom bashing, where they go out as a community and they cut back the invasive plant. Broom bashing, it's great. and sort of yearly efforts to keep the invasive under control have brought back ecological diversity in a lot of these parks. So when people kind of want to put a little effort in to bring something back where they live, then they really can do that.
Yes.
So I think some of the things, the challenges that bees face are going to continue being present, sort of a lack of places to live. Global climate change, creating stress on their populations, all of these things together are still going to be present, but we can take action to try and kind of counterbalance that by giving them places to be. Give the bees places to be. It's a terrible pun.
Yes, it is. So this actually kind of leads to the next question. So since some of our audience are actually farmers, actually this year for 4-H, I am giving a speech this year as a senior. I am talking about monoculture and how that affects kind of like the biodiversity of an area. And part of my speech talks about crop margins and conservation strips, which is, when I was doing my research, I found, we'll plant some bee-friendly flowers on the outskirts of monocultural fields. So from your perspective, what are your thoughts about that, and where does Canada sit with this practice?
So Canada, as far as research goes, is a little bit behind. There's a few people in the States, several people in the States who've done some really great work showing that this can be a viable way to bring back biodiversity to places where there's monoculture. Where, when you plant a monoculture, even if it's something that bees can eat, it's that sort of McDonald's for a week problem, right? So it's similar to the invasive plant, that there's food for a week when the sunflowers or the almonds are flowering, and then there's nothing, right? So then bees can't really survive there. So it's a viable strategy, but to get farmers engaged, you have to show that it's economically viable or give them some incentive, right? So the states in some different places have tried incentives. So, we'll help pay you to take part of your land out of production and turn it into sort of these pollinator pastures. And then you kind of see what happens over time. But the problem is when those incentives go away, they're trying to make a living, right? So they have to kind of balance, do I keep this and is it giving me any benefit? With the upkeep and the cost of having that land out of production. So I think we need a lot more information in Canada, and the kinds of things you would plant for different crops might be different, because you don't want the things that you plant to interfere with pollination of the crop or to bring in diseases, plant diseases or pests that are going to make life harder for the farmer. So we need research. I'm a researcher, so of course I'm going to say that, but it's one of those things where we do need to do a lot more work to see if it's something that farmers could be doing.
And after, with all that research, what would be the best strategy to make everybody just, aware of the situation, and be like, hey, we've proven this, try it out, help our women pollinators?
We have Agriculture Canada is a great federal research branch that has really generally good relationships with farmers, and when you show that something works and is helpful farmers are interested.
Yes.
Right? And maybe they're not all interested. Maybe it's not something that they think is practical, but some might. And if farmers are growing pollinator-dependent crops, they're very much aware of the cost of bringing in honeybees, of some of the challenges in convincing beekeepers to let them use their bees.
Yes.
And potentially in some crops, the advantages of having native pollinators that might actually be more efficient at pollinating their crops, for example, blueberry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that actually leads to the next question in a bit. Is there any app or program that people can use or start utilizing to get more involved with the conservation of pollinators?
So I did a little look, and the Xerces Society is a conservation society. They're for conservation of arthropods, but they actually have done a lot of work on crop margins and things like that. And they have plant lists.
Oh, I see.
Right, so they have plant lists. And then there's if you go to pollinator.org/Canada, so that's another US nonprofit that also has a Canadian branch, and they have planting lists.
Oh,
so, if you're like, well, what do I plant for the bees where I live? What are good plants that will, survive? They have some resources as well. And they have some links to some other more local societies. There's one in Vancouver Island that's more concerned with that Garryoak ecosystem I was telling you about. And I'm involved with some folks in trying to get something new started here in the Lower Main that might integrate across all of British Columbia. So you can stay tuned for that. As far as apps go, my colleague Elizabeth has worked on one, and it's in beta. So it's in beta. So stay tuned. When it's out of beta, I will let you know.
Sounds good. See, we started getting interested a lot in bumblebees. My sister actually, she is doing a 4-H speech this year. She actually talked about bumblebees and how to help them. And part of her speech mentions an app that we started using called Bumblebee Watch.
Yes.
And that's where actually, when we first looked at it, we thought it was probably really cool how you could, take pictures. They send it out to a specialist and they identify the bumblebee. Mm-hmm. So do you think that would be a good app to get people involved?
Yeah, the citizen science aspect is a great way to collect data. And this is the thing about what's going to happen in 20 years and what's happening with the Rusty Patched Bumblebees. If we're going to know, we have to get information.
Yes.
And getting people involved in collecting that sort of citizen science level of information is a great way to know, maybe this bee that we thought was uncommon because we were looking here is actually present over here. And we found that on Vancouver Island with the white-tailed bumblebees, that you weren't really seeing it in these parks, but it's hanging out in people's gardens. It's not common, but it's there in the garden.
Yeah.
Though you might not, if you were only looking in the parks, you might not know that it was present. So getting people involved in collecting data for scientists to go and say, there's a population of this species that, we didn't know was there, is actually present. And it can also help us sound the alarm. So when Occidentalis, when the white-tailed bumblebee and Rusty Patched Bumblebee both started to decline, people weren't really collecting data. So there was this decline happening, and one of the problems is we don't entirely know why, because no one was looking, right? So now we have people with their phones can help collect this data and maybe sound the alarm if similar patterns start to occur in other species.
Oh, I see. So with that concludes all the questions. You said you had some specimens.
I do. I have some specimens from Vancouver Island I would like to show you all.
Awesome.
So here we are. I don't quite know how that would work. So yeah, we've got, this is specifically for Vancouver Island, but these are 7 different species of bumblebees with different color patterns. And then a lot of the sort of native bees that are solitary, including some of those bright green, beautiful metallic bees you were talking about.